The courtroom was silent, save for the faint rustle of papers and the occasional creak of wooden benches. A shaft of pale sunlight filtered through the tall, narrow windows, illuminating the face of the defendant. A black woman standing resolute, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her eyes held a quiet strength, one born of a lifetime of navigating a world where justice often faltered at the intersection of race and power. All eyes were on her. The prosecutor's gaze was sharp and unyielding, the defense attorney's expression tense and anxious. Yet it was the judge, a middle-aged white man seated high on the bench, who seemed most uneasy. He shuffled his notes, avoiding her steady gaze, as if preparing himself for what was to come. The room seemed to hold its breath as she prepared to speak. This was no ordinary moment, and everyone present could feel it. This wasn't just about her guilt or innocence. It was about something much larger. The weight of history pressed down on the room, heavy with the stories of those who had stood where she stood now, fighting to be heard in a system that too often silenced them. But how had it come to this? The woman, whose name was Maria Evans, had lived a life of quiet resilience. Born in a small southern town, she had been no stranger to hardship. From a young age, she had learned to navigate a world that saw her skin color as a barrier, a mark of otherness. Despite this, she had worked hard, raised her children, and built a life for herself. Yet, it was a single act of defiance that had brought her here, a decision to stand up against an injustice that many others might have endured in silence. Months earlier, Maria had been arrested after a confrontation with police. The details of the incident had been hotly contested, but one fact was clear. Maria had refused to yield to an officer's unlawful demand, insisting instead on her dignity and her rights. That act of resistance had set off a chain of events that led her to this courtroom, where her fate now rested in the hands of a system that had never been designed for her. As Maria stood there, she knew this moment was about more than just her. Her voice carried the weight of countless others who had faced similar injustices, their stories untold and unheard. She took a deep breath, her resolve firm. Whatever the outcome, she would speak her truth. Would her words be enough to pierce the veil of bias that clouded this courtroom? Could they reach the heart of the man who would decide her fate? The judge cleared his throat, signaling that it was time for Maria to make her final statement. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion she felt deep within. In that moment, the courtroom seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as her words began to fill the space. The story that brought Maria Evans to this courtroom was one of quiet resistance, a confrontation with a system that often demanded submission over justice. On a humid summer evening in her small town, Maria had been driving home from her job as a nurse's aide. Exhausted from her shift, she had barely noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror until the police cruiser was directly behind her. Maria pulled over, confused but cooperative. The officer approached her car, his demeanor brusque, his tone commanding. "License and registration," he barked without explanation. Maria complied, handing over her documents. But the officer wasn't satisfied. He began questioning her aggressively about where she was coming from and why she was out so late. When Maria politely asked for the reason she was stopped, the officer's irritation grew. "Step out of the car," he ordered. She hesitated. What had she done wrong? The officer, now visibly angry, accused her of resisting and demanded that she comply immediately. Maria refused, citing her rights and insisting that she hadn't broken any laws. The situation escalated. The officer called for backup, and within minutes, Maria was handcuffed on the side of the road. Her children, watching from a neighbor's house, would later describe the scene with tears in their eyes. Their mother, a figure of strength, forced into submission by those meant to protect her. The official charge, obstruction of justice. But to Maria and many others, it was clear this was an abuse of power, rooted in prejudice rather than any actual wrongdoing. This wasn't the first time Maria had faced the sting of systemic injustice. Growing up, she had witnessed her parents struggle to make ends meet while being denied opportunities simply because of their skin color. As an adult, she had endured countless moments of subtle and overt racism. being followed in stores, overlooked for promotions, and subjected to demeaning assumptions. Each incident had been a reminder of the unspoken rules governing her existence. But this time, Maria chose to fight back. She refused to accept a plea deal, even when it would have meant avoiding a lengthy trial. She believed her case wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for those who couldn't. The trial became a microcosm of the racial and social injustices plaguing the nation. The prosecutor painted Maria as uncooperative, someone who thought she was above the law. Her defense attorney, a young public defender, struggled to counter the narrative, hampered by limited resources and a system that seemed designed to convict rather than seek truth. At the center of it all was Judge Alan Whitaker. A man in his 50s, Judge Whitaker had spent decades on the bench, presiding over cases with what he believed to be impartiality. But impartiality, Maria's defense argued, was a myth in a system steeped in racial bias. Judge Whitaker saw himself as a fair man. He prided himself on upholding the law and treating all parties equally. Yet, as he listened to the testimony, he couldn't ignore the growing discomfort in his chest. Was it possible that the system he had devoted his life to was flawed in ways he hadn't allowed himself to see? The trial dragged on, each day peeling back another layer of Maria's life and the circumstances surrounding her arrest. Witnesses testified about the officer's history of aggressive behavior, particularly toward black residents. Experts presented data on racial profiling, showing how Maria's case was part of a much larger pattern. Yet, despite the evidence, Judge Whitaker struggled to reconcile these revelations with his deeply ingrained belief in the fairness of the law. He had always seen the courtroom as a place of justice, but Maria's case was forcing him to confront the uncomfortable reality that justice wasn't blind. It often saw color first. Maria, for her part, remained steadfast. Her courage in the face of overwhelming odds was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She knew the stakes were high, not just for her, but for the countless others whose stories would never make it to a courtroom. As the trial neared its conclusion, tensions ran high. The courtroom had become a battleground, a place where Maria's fight for dignity collided with a system unwilling to admit its faults. The weight of the conflict was palpable, pressing down on everyone in the room. Would Judge Whitaker be able to see beyond his biases, to hear Maria's truth and recognize the broader implications of her case? Or would he, like so many others, choose the path of least resistance, upholding the status quo at the expense of justice? The trial's crescendo began on the third day, as Maria Evans prepared to take the stand. Her defense attorney had spent sleepless nights working with her to craft a statement that would not only defend her actions, but expose the broader injustices at play. Despite the overwhelming odds, Maria carried herself with an unshakable resolve. She understood that this moment could be transformative, not just for her, but for everyone watching. As she walked to the witness stand, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters scribbled notes, observers leaned forward in their seats, and Judge Whitaker adjusted his glasses, bracing himself for what was to come. Maria's voice, steady but tinged with emotion, cut through the courtroom's tension. She began by recounting the events of that fateful night, her words vivid and precise. She described the fear that gripped her as the officer's demeanor turned hostile, the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of her children, and the helplessness she felt as her pleas for fairness were ignored. But Maria didn't stop at her personal experience. She pivoted, speaking to the broader context of her case. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It's about every person who has ever been treated as less than simply because of the color of their skin. It's about a system that sees us as threats first and human beings second." Her words hung in the air, their weight impossible to ignore. The prosecutor tried to object, claiming irrelevance, but Judge Whitaker overruled him. For the first time, the judge seemed genuinely curious, leaning forward as Maria continued. She spoke of her life, of the countless microaggressions and overt acts of discrimination she had faced. She shared stories of friends and neighbors who had been similarly targeted, weaving a tapestry of injustice that was both deeply personal and undeniably systemic. "It's not just the officer who stopped me that night," Maria said, locking eyes with the judge. It's the policies and practices that allow someone like him to act without accountability. It's the unspoken bias that treats people like me as criminals before we're even given a chance. As she spoke, something began to shift in Judge Whitaker. He found himself recalling moments from his own life. An offhand remark from a colleague, a questionable ruling he had handed down years ago, the uncomfortable feeling he dismissed when a black defendant insisted they were being unfairly targeted. Memories he had buried or ignored now surfaced, demanding his attention. Maria continued, her voice unwavering. She challenged the prosecution's narrative, dismantling the idea that her refusal to comply was an act of defiance rather than a defense of her dignity. She cited the law, pointing out that she had every right to ask why she was being stopped. If standing up for my rights makes me guilty, she said, her voice filled with quiet fury, then what does that say about the rights we're all supposed to have? Her words landed like a hammer blow, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Even the prosecutor seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Judge Whitaker felt a knot tightening in his chest. He had always prided himself on being impartial, but Maria's testimony was forcing him to confront the cracks in his worldview. He thought of his upbringing in a predominantly white, middle-class neighborhood where people spoke in hushed tones about those neighborhoods and those people. He remembered the unease he felt the first time he presided over a case involving a young black man, a feeling he had brushed aside as mere inexperience. Now, listening to Maria, he couldn't deny the truth staring him in the face. The system he had long believed to be fair and just was deeply flawed, and he was complicit in its perpetuation. Maria's testimony concluded with a plea, not just for herself but for justice as a whole. I'm not asking for special treatment, she said. I'm asking for fairness, for humanity, for the chance to live in a world where my children don't have to fear the people who are supposed to protect them. As she stepped down from the stand, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Maria's words had pierced the carefully constructed facade of impartiality that the legal system prided itself on. For Judge Whitaker, the moment was transformative. He couldn't shake Maria's words or the memories they had stirred within him. For the first time in years, he questioned not only his role as a judge, but the very foundation of the system he served. The courtroom sat in silence as Maria stepped down from the witness stand, her final words still resonating in the air. Even the most stoic faces in the room betrayed cracks of emotion. Furrowed brows, tightened jaws, and glances exchanged among spectators. The tension was palpable, yet beneath it lay something else: reflection. For Judge Alan Whitaker, the silence was deafening. Maria's testimony had struck a chord he couldn't ignore. He leaned back in his chair, gazing at the stack of legal documents in front of him, their black and white text now feeling woefully inadequate to capture the complexity of what he had just heard. Her words had pierced the armor of his judicial detachment, forcing him to confront truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The law was supposed to be impartial, yet how often had it been wielded unequally? How many times had he dismissed claims of systemic bias as exaggeration or mere rhetoric? Now, faced with Maria's raw, undeniable truth, he realized his perspective had been limited by his privilege. Maria's defense attorney, emboldened by her powerful testimony, seized the moment. She addressed the court with passion, weaving Maria's story into a larger narrative about systemic inequities. What we've seen in this case, she argued, is not just an isolated incident, but a symptom of a broader issue, one that demands our attention and action. This trial isn't just about Maria Evans. It's about justice itself. The prosecutor, who had been confident in his case just days earlier, now seemed less sure. He fumbled through his closing arguments, attempting to refocus the jury on the charge of obstruction. But even he appeared shaken, his tone less assured, his words falling flat in the wake of Maria's eloquence. When the jury retired to deliberate, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Conversations broke out in hushed tones, and spectators exchanged thoughtful glances. Reporters hurriedly typed their impressions, already framing the case as more than just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. Behind the bench, Judge Whitaker sat lost in thought. He replayed Maria's words in his mind, If standing up for my rights makes me guilty, then what does that say about the rights we're all supposed to have? The question echoed like a challenge, demanding more than just a legal ruling. It demanded accountability. Hours later, the jury returned with a verdict: not guilty. The announcement was met with gasps of relief and quiet cheers from Maria's supporters. Tears streamed down Maria's face as she hugged her attorney, the weight of the moment finally breaking through her stoic resolve. But the trial's impact didn't end with the verdict. In the weeks that followed, Maria's case became a flashpoint for broader discussions about racial bias in policing and the justice system. Her story spread like wildfire, amplified by social media and news outlets. Activists and community leaders seized the opportunity to push for reforms, organizing town halls, marches, and meetings with local officials. Judge Whitaker, too, found himself irrevocably changed. Maria's words had sparked a personal transformation, compelling him to take a hard look at his own role within the system. He began attending seminars on implicit bias and sought out conversations with colleagues and community leaders to better understand the experiences of marginalized groups. For the first time, he saw his courtroom not just as a place to enforce the law, but as a platform to challenge its inequities. Months after the trial, Judge Whitaker delivered a speech at a legal conference, addressing a room full of judges, attorneys, and policymakers. He spoke candidly about the lessons he had learned from Maria's case, urging his peers to confront the biases that permeated their work. Justice, he said, is not blind. It sees the world through the lens we create for it. And if we want it to see clearly, we must be willing to challenge the distortions of our own making. Maria, meanwhile, became an unlikely but powerful advocate for change. Though she returned to her life with her family, she continued to share her story, lending her voice to efforts aimed at reforming policing practices and ensuring accountability. She was invited to speak at rallies, colleges, and even legislative hearings, her words inspiring countless others to take action. The ripple effects of her courage were undeniable. In her small town, police departments began implementing bias training and community outreach programs. On a state level, lawmakers introduced bills aimed at curbing racial profiling and increasing oversight of law enforcement. Maria's trial had become more than a personal victory. It was a catalyst for transformation. It reminded everyone who heard her story that change often begins with a single voice, daring to speak out against injustice. And for Judge Whitaker, the memory of Maria's testimony would stay with him for the rest of his life. It served as a constant reminder of the power of truth and the responsibility of those in power to listen. Months after the trial, Maria Evans sat on the front porch of her modest home, watching her children play in the yard. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but it was a new normal, one imbued with purpose and the lingering weight of what she had endured. Maria had become more than a mother and community member. She was now a symbol of resilience and change. Her story had transcended the courtroom, becoming a rallying cry for justice reform. People from across the country reached out to her, sharing their own stories of injustice and thanking her for inspiring them to speak up. For Maria, the trial's aftermath was both empowering and humbling. She had always considered herself an ordinary woman, but now she understood the extraordinary impact of standing firm in the face of adversity. She began to volunteer with local organizations dedicated to legal aid and community empowerment, using her platform to advocate for those who felt voiceless. Her case catalyzed a wave of change in her town. Community leaders, spurred by public outcry, established forums for dialogue between residents and law enforcement. Police departments introduced new protocols, including mandatory bias training and the establishment of civilian oversight boards. Schools incorporated lessons on civic responsibility and racial equity into their curricula, fostering a generation more aware of systemic inequalities. Maria's courage had sparked a movement, but the ripples extended far beyond her immediate surroundings. In his chambers, Judge Alan Whitaker often found himself reflecting on Maria's trial. It had been a turning point, not just professionally but personally. For years, he had prided himself on his impartiality. Yet Maria's case had shown him that neutrality in the face of injustice was complicity. Determined to do better, he immersed himself in understanding systemic bias, reading books, and attending workshops that challenged his preconceived notions. He sought mentorship from colleagues who had long been vocal about reform, and he began mentoring younger judges, encouraging them to approach their roles with both empathy and accountability. His rulings, too, began to reflect his newfound awareness. In cases where systemic inequities were at play, he used his authority to push for alternatives to incarceration and advocate for restorative justice measures. Beyond the bench, he partnered with legal organizations to advocate for changes in sentencing guidelines and greater transparency in judicial processes. Judge Whitaker became a quiet but steadfast ally in the fight for equity, his transformation a testament to the power of self-reflection and the willingness to change. Maria's story resonated far beyond her small town, amplified by the power of social media and grassroots activism. Her trial became a case study for legal scholars and a rallying point for advocates of justice reform. Politicians cited her experience as evidence of the need for systemic change, while activists used it to galvanize support for new policies. Conversations about racial bias in policing and the justice system gained new momentum, driven by Maria's ability to humanize the issue. She had shown that behind every statistic was a person with a story, a family, and dreams worth protecting. Over time, state and national reforms began to take shape. Laws were passed to increase accountability for law enforcement officers, reduce mandatory minimum sentences, and expand access to legal representation for marginalized communities. Though progress was incremental, Maria's case served as a reminder that change often starts with a single spark. Years later, Maria stood on a stage at a national justice reform conference, addressing a crowd of advocates, policymakers, and everyday citizens. She spoke not as a victim, but as a survivor, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "I'm not here because I'm extraordinary," she said. "I'm here because I refuse to be silenced. I refuse to accept that this system, broken as it is, should have the final word on my worth or my rights. My story is just one of millions, and while I'm grateful for the changes we've seen, I know the work is far from over. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. And it's a journey we must all commit to every single day." As she looked out at the audience, she saw faces filled with determination, people ready to carry the torch of change. Maria's words had inspired not just reflection but action, proving that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged when confronted with the undeniable power of truth. Maria's story, and the changes it inspired, left a lasting legacy. It reminded people that the fight for justice requires both courage and persistence, and that progress is possible when individuals are willing to stand up, speak out, and demand better. For every person who read about Maria's trial, who heard her speak, or who reflected on her words, the message was clear. The power to create change lies within each of us. As the audience left that conference, her final words echoed in their minds. "Justice is not the responsibility of the few. It is the responsibility of us all. If my voice could spark change, imagine what we can do together.